And I'm the one who will not raise taxes. My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort, or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into. My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will. And the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes. Welcome back to another lesson in U.S. history. I'm excited to have you here today. Today we're going to take a closer look at the presidency of George H.W. Bush and talk about some of the significant events of his presidency, most specifically the Gulf War. George H.W. Bush was the 41st president of the United States. He was the former vice president of Ronald Reagan and kind of promised Americans that, what you got with Reagan's what you get with me. He brought to the White House, this concept of American traditional values and a vision of a future where the United States and its people were a kinder and gentler nation. He also promised Americans, read my lips, no new taxes. Americans liked that. Unfortunately for George H.W. Bush, that's going to come back to bite him. George H.W. Bush was born on June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. On his 18th birthday, he enlisted in the armed forces and would become the youngest pilot to receive his wings in the Navy. He went on to fly 58 combat missions during World War II. In one mission over the Pacific, his plane was shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft, and he was picked up and rescued by a U.S. submarine. In January of 1945, he went on to marry Barbara Pierce and have 6 children. For his education, he went to Yale University. He was a good student and the captain of the baseball team. After graduation, he moved out to West Texas to get involved in the oil industry. Bush would serve 2 terms as a representative for Texas in the House of Representatives. Bush had 2 unsuccessful campaigns to be in the Senate, but was later appointed to several high positions in the United States government. He was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He was chairman of the Republican National Committee, and he was the director of the CIA. In 1980, he ran a campaign for president, but lost the nomination to Reagan, who picked him up as his running mate. And then in 1988, he won the Republican nomination and chose as his running mate for vice president Dan Quayle. He went on to defeat Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. The world was changing around President Bush. The Cold War was over, and the empire of communist countries was collapsing. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the United States no longer had an arch nemesis. In areas of foreign policy, Bush sent American troops to Panama to overthrow the dictator Manuel Noriega. Noriega was threatening the security of the Panama Canal, as well as the lives of Americans living in Panama. Noriega was captured and brought to the United States to be tried as a drug trafficker. Perhaps the greatest test of Bush's presidency was when the dictator Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded the country of Kuwait. While Bush's foreign policies were winning him great amounts of renown and respect and popularity, his domestic policies were lacking, and the test finally came to see if he was going to be true to his word. Or are we going to raise taxes? And Congress began to push, and they pushed, and Bush said no, and they pushed again. And finally, Bush was forced to come to an agreement, and taxes went up. And so Bush's critics pointed to him and said, you said you wouldn't raise taxes, and you did. And there were many Americans also who felt like they had been, promised this thing, and he had not followed through with it. And therefore, he lost some points in the end. And that's going to really come back to haunt him in 1992 when he runs for re-election as the incumbent. Now let's get some background in the Persian Gulf War. Now, throughout the 1980s, the country of Iraq and the country of Iran had been at war with each other. This had cost them both a lot of money and led to lots of political tensions, some of which we talked about with the crisis in Lebanon, the Iran-Contra affair. But when that war, the Iraq-Iran war, was coming to an end, people thought there was going to be peace. Suddenly, the dictator Saddam Hussein gave a very incendiary speech about how Iraq had been cheated out of billions of dollars of revenue in oil by the country of Kuwait. He demanded that they cancel $30 billion of debt that Iraq owed Kuwait. He then accused them of conspiring to keep oil prices low, which was costing Iraq money as well, as oil was their most profitable export. It was then in 1990 that Saddam Hussein began to amass his army on the border of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein was counting on the support of the other Arab nations around him. He thought that if I can get all the support from countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, then, well, the United States won't try and intervene. Then on August 2nd, 1990, the army of Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. It turns out Saddam Hussein was wrong. He did not receive the support from other Arab nations he expected. In fact, most of the countries, especially like Saudi Arabia, condemned his actions. Hussein was labeled the aggressor in this, and the rest of the world looked to see what is the United States and NATO going to do about this. George Bush and the United States, as well as Britain and the Soviet Union, condemned Saddam Hussein's invasion. On August 3rd, the United Nations issued orders for Iraq to pull out its troops from Kuwait. Then on August 8th, Saddam Hussein, having ignored those orders, formally annexed Kuwait, claiming now it's a part of Iraq. The United States began to initiate Operation Desert Shield, which was sending their militaries, sending the airplanes and their navy to this region of the world to protect oil reserves and our allies, especially Saudi Arabia. Then on November 29th, 1990, the United Nations Security Council issued a by all necessary means of force against Iraq if it did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15th. When January finally arrived, the Allies and the other coalition forces began preparations for an invasion. Now, the United States definitely had, the largest force there on the scene among the coalitions, but, the British, the French, the Germans, the Soviets, Japan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia all were involved in this coalition force, this united force, to right this wrong that had been committed by Saddam Hussein. Well, January 15th came and went, and Saddam Hussein had not pulled out his troops. So then on January 17th, 1991, the United States began bombing Iraq. Then on January 17th, 1991, the United States began a strategic bombing campaign of Iraq, knocking out its anti-air and anti-missile defenses. They attacked their communications networks, their oil refineries, their weapon plants. This coalition effort was known as Operation Desert Storm. And by this point, by the early 90s, technology has advanced quite a lot. And the world is starting to see kind of, what all of the United States' new fancy military toys can do. Things like smart bombs and stealth bombers with laser guidance systems and infrared night bombing equipment. The Iraqi Air Force was either destroyed very early on or just opted to not even try and compete with all that was thrown at them. The objective for the coalition forces was to win the war in the air, to try and minimize the need for ground troops. But by mid-February, the coalition forces began to launch their troops on the ground. Operation Desert Saber was launched on February 24th. And in the next 4 days, the coalition forces surrounded and drove out the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. U.S. troops were driving the Iraqi forces back 120 miles into the country of Iraq, knocking out oil refineries as they went. By February 27th, most of Iraq's elite troops had been destroyed or defeated. With Iraq's resistance nearing collapse, President Bush issued a ceasefire on February 28th. I imagine it's kind of like you're watching a UFC fight against two people, and one guy is clearly just pummeling the other, and the other is there's a guy on the ground, he's like a blood in his face, and he's like kind of a ragdolling a little bit, and the ref steps in and is like, whoa, okay, fight's over, it's over. That's kind of how this went, and it was a first round knockout. Peace terms were put forth, and Hussein was forced really to sign them. He was forced to leave Kuwait, get all his troops out. He was also forced to destroy any weapons of mass destruction that he had in Iraq. Things like nuclear technology, biological weapons, and chemical weapons. Around 10,000 Iraqi troops were killed, and around 300 coalition forces were killed during the Persian Gulf War. This war is recognized as a decisive victory, perhaps one of the most decisive victories in history. And yet, Saddam Hussein remained in power. For now. In 1992, George H.W. Bush will lose the election to a man by the name of William Jefferson Clinton from Hope, Arkansas, and that's what I want to talk about next time. Thank you all for watching. I'm so glad you're here. I love you all. Make it a great day. Then on November 29th, 1990, the United Nations Security Council